The chandeliers burned like captured constellations above the assembly, each trembling crystal scattering light across silk gowns and polished floors. Yet none of that brilliance could soften the sharp edge of judgment that pressed upon Miss Eliza Hartwell as she stood alone near the towering windows, her reflection fractured in the dark glass, her posture rigid with a dignity she refused to relinquish despite the murmurs that followed her every breath, whispers that curled like smoke through the room, staining her name with a scandal she had neither invited nor deserved on this merciless night that marked her quiet undoing. Earlier that season, her laughter had carried easily through such rooms, bright as champagne and twice as fleeting, yet a single cruel rumor had undone years of careful upbringing, transforming admiration into curiosity and curiosity into disdain, until every polite smile concealed calculation and every bow masked avoidance. And though no accusation had ever been proven, the absence of proof only sharpened society's appetite for speculation, leaving her suspended between innocence and condemnation with no refuge but silence and the brittle composure she now wore like armor against their relentless gaze, as whispers clung to her like frost upon a rose. Her mother, pale with contained panic, lingered nearby among the matrons, offering forced smiles that faltered whenever fans snapped open or a whisper sharpened, while her father remained at a measured distance, his expression fixed in a silence more condemning than anger, as though the daughter he had once presented with pride had become an inconvenience best managed through arrangement rather than affection. And Eliza felt that distance keenly, a widening chasm that threatened to swallow what little certainty she possessed about her place in their world, and she refused to let them see how it wounded her heart. A sudden hush descended not gradually but with the sharpness of a blade, cleaving through conversation as the great doors opened and admitted his grace, the Duke of Ravenscroft, whose presence altered the very air of the room, for he carried with him a reputation forged in ruthlessness and sustained by an almost mythic indifference to sentiment, a man whispered to have dismantled fortunes and silenced enemies with equal precision, his gaze cold as winter steel as it swept across the assembly, and settled at last upon Eliza, as though she alone warranted his attention. In that unforgiving, charged moment, she did not curtsy at once, though every instinct drilled into her since childhood urged immediate obedience. Instead, she met his gaze with steadiness born not of confidence but of necessity, for there remained little left to lose beyond the fragile remnants of her pride, and in that suspended instant something unspoken passed between them, an awareness that neither belonged fully to the world that surrounded them, though his expression revealed nothing beyond a faint tightening at the corner of his mouth, as though her defiance intrigued him rather than offended him in a manner both unsettling and compelling. The announcement came not from the Duke but from her father, whose voice cut through the lingering silence with an authority that brooked no interruption, declaring before the assembled nobility that an arrangement had been reached and that Miss Eliza Hartwell would soon become the Duchess of Ravenscroft, the words falling like iron chains upon the marble floor, echoing outward until they struck every listening ear with equal force, and the collective intake of breath that followed seemed to drain the warmth from the room entirely, leaving astonishment to curdle into fascination and darker thrill of impending ruin for all. Eliza felt every gaze converge upon her like the tightening threads of a net, yet it was the Duke's attention that anchored her in place, for he regarded her not with the disdain she had come to expect, but with a deliberate assessment that unsettled her more profoundly than any insult, as though he weighed her worth against some private measure known only to himself, and found in her not a liability but a challenge he had already resolved to claim, without regard for consequence or consent or the fragile dignity she fought so fiercely to preserve within herself alone. When the dance resumed at last, tentative notes rising as though uncertain of their welcome, the Duke crossed the distance between them with an inevitability that stilled even the most persistent whispers, and without requesting permission, he extended his gloved hand toward her, the gesture both invitation and command, leaving her with a choice that was no choice at all. For refusal would invite further spectacle, while acceptance bound her more tightly to the fate now unfolding before them, and in that moment she understood that she decided would echo beyond this single dance into the shape of her life. She placed her hand in his, feeling the firm closure of his fingers around hers as he drew her into the measured cadence of dance, his voice low enough to evade the nearest ears as he spoke. "You stand as though the world has ended, Miss Hartwell, yet I assure you it has only begun." And the quiet certainty in his tone unsettled her more than any cruelty might have done, for it suggested a future she had not chosen, and could not yet escape no matter how fiercely she might resist the inexorable force of his will now. She lifted her chin, refusing to yield the remnants of her defiance, and answered him with composure that masked the tremor beneath her ribs. "I would rather be despised for truth than pitied for obedience, your grace," the words leaving her lips with steadiness she scarcely felt. And for an instant his gaze sharpened into something dangerously alive, as though her challenge had struck a hidden fault within him, before he inclined his head and replied with, "Then I shall ensure you are neither pitied nor ignored," drawing her closer as the music swelled around them. The wedding unfolded with precision that allowed no room for sentiment, each vow spoken as though it were a clause in a contract rather than a promise between souls. And though the cathedral blazed with candlelight and echoed with solemn music, Eliza felt only the weight of inevitability pressing upon her chest as she stood beside the Duke, her hand enclosed in his with an unyielding firmness that neither comforted nor restrained, but simply asserted that her life had crossed an invisible threshold from which there would be no graceful retreat. When the final blessing was given and the congregation exhaled its collective curiosity, she became Duchess of Ravenscroft not through triumph or affection, but through necessity. And as she stepped into the waiting carriage beneath a sky that threatened rain, she realized with quiet clarity that her reputation had not been restored but merely transferred, absorbed into a greater power that would define her more completely than scandal ever could. And she wondered whether such protection was merely another form of erasure. Ravenscroft House rose in the countryside like a monument to control, its vast stone facade untouched by warmth, its windows reflecting the world rather than inviting it within, and as Eliza crossed its threshold she felt not welcome but assessed, as though the very walls measured her worth against the silence that permeated every corridor, while the staff bowed with perfect deference that carried neither curiosity nor kindness, only the practiced efficiency of those who served a master, whose expectations tolerated no deviation. The Duke did not linger at her side upon their arrival, instead entrusting her to the housekeeper with a brief instruction that was neither unkind nor considerate, leaving her to navigate her new domain alone. And though the gesture might have suggested indifference, Eliza sensed something more deliberate beneath it, a test perhaps, or an expectation that she would either conform to the rhythm of his household or fracture against it. And she resolved, with a quiet tightening of her resolve, that she would do neither without leaving her mark. Their first formal interaction as husband and wife occurred not in intimacy, but in display, within a drawing-room adorned with restrained opulence, where he presented her with a velvet case, its contents revealed to be a necklace of black diamonds that gleamed with cold, almost ominous brilliance, each stone catching the light like fragments of shadow. And though the gift was undeniably magnificent, it carried with a message that Eliza could not ignore, one a possession disguised as generosity and expectation wrapped in elegance. She lifted the necklace carefully, allowing its weight to rest against her palm as she regarded it with measured calm, then met his gaze without flinching as she spoke. "A cage, your grace, is no less a cage for being adorned." Her voice steady despite the tension coiling within her, and though his expression did not change dramatically, she noted the subtle shift in his posture. The faint narrowing of his eyes that suggested her defiance had not gone unnoticed, and perhaps not unappreciated in ways she did not yet understand. Days passed in a delicate balance of restraint and provocation, each interaction between them layered with unspoken challenges, as he issued instructions that tested her compliance, and she responded with quiet independence that refused to yield entirely. And though no argument ever erupted into open conflict, the tension between them grew increasingly palpable, like a storm gathering strength beneath a deceptively calm sky, until even the servants seemed to move more cautiously in their presence, aware of the silent war unfolding within their master's halls. The true trial arrived with the first grand dinner they hosted, an event attended by those who had once whispered about her downfall and now returned with sharpened curiosity, eager to witness whether the Duchess would command respect or confirm their suspicions. And as Eliza entered the dining room adorned in deep emerald silk, the black diamonds resting at her throat like a challenge, she felt every gaze settle upon her with renewed intensity, measuring, questioning, anticipating the moment she might falter beneath the weight of their scrutiny. It was Lady Winthrop who struck first, her voice sweet with false concern as she recounted the circumstances of Eliza's earlier disgrace with a precision that bordered on cruelty, each word carefully chosen to provoke while maintaining the illusion of propriety. and for a fleeting moment the room seemed to contract around Eliza, the air thick with expectation, as all waited to see whether she would defend herself or retreat into silence. And though her pulse quickened, she held her composure, with a grace that belied the storm within. Before she could respond, the Duke's voice cut through the tension with a quiet authority that silenced even the most eager listener, his gaze fixed upon Lady Winthrop as he spoke. "You mistake my silence for ignorance, madam. I assure you I chose my Duchess with full awareness and greater intent," and the weight of his words settled over the table with unmistakable force, transforming the narrative from scandal into declaration, and leaving no doubt that any further insult would not be tolerated, not for her sake alone, but for his own. The conversation shifted, though unease lingered beneath its surface, and as the evening drew to a close, Eliza found herself both unsettled and unexpectedly shielded, uncertain whether his defense had been an act of loyalty or ownership, and the distinction troubled her more than the attack itself, for it suggested a complexity within him that she had not yet fully grasped, one that blurred the boundaries between protection and control in ways that demanded careful navigation if she were to retain any sense of autonomy within their union. Later that night, within the quiet of her chamber, she discovered a second offering placed upon her writing desk, a small book of poetry bound in worn leather, its pages marked with annotations in the Duke's precise hand. And as she turned to a passage underlined with deliberate care, she read the words. Even the fiercest storms bowed to a quiet, unwavering flame, and felt a flicker of something unfamiliar stir within her, a doubt not of his power, but of his intentions, as though beneath his severity lay a truth he had yet to reveal. The storm arrived without warning, rain lashing against the windows as thunder rolled across the estate, and unable to sleep, the rain fell with relentless insistence, thrumming against the roof of the carriage as it carried them to the countryside, a silver blur of wind-swept trees and sodden fields passing beyond the glass like a moving painting. And in that small shaking space, Eliza Hartwell felt the walls of her carefully constructed composure begin to lean inward, pressing against her ribs with the weight of anticipation and fear, for neither of them spoke. Yet the air between them pulsed with the unspoken, the potential of revelation she had long both feared and desired. The carriage jolted suddenly, sending her gloved hands against the polished wood, and the horses shied at the sound of distant thunder, a cascade of lightning illuminating the tight confines of the compartment in stark white bursts, revealing the Duke's profile in such sharp relief that every line of his face seemed etched by consequence and restraint. And for a moment, she saw not the feared raven of society, the Iron Duke whispered of in hushed tones, but simply a man burdened with invisible chains. Their forced proximity, imposed by a carriage accident that had left the road impassable, made ordinary pleasantries impossible, and so silence fell, thick and almost tangible, broken only by the rhythmic pounding of rain, and the occasional shuffle of the horses' hooves against the mud-laden path, a sound that mirrored the restlessness within her chest, where curiosity warred with caution, and desire warred with the rigid instruction she had been raised to obey. At last her restraint, tested to its limit, found voice, low and deliberate. "You wield silence like a weapon, your grace, yet expect understanding in return." And the words, though carefully chosen, carried the full weight of her frustration, the quiet rebellion of a woman who had endured whispers, insinuations, and assumptions without complaint, yet could no longer endure the unmeasured cold of a husband who, though bound to her by law and ceremony, remained cloaked in mystery and control. The Duke's eyes, dark and unreadable, lingered upon her, and for the first time she allowed herself to note the small human fissures beneath the surface of his perfection, the faint tremor of a hand, the almost imperceptible tension in his jaw, a shadow that did not belong to the storm outside, but to the years he had carried in solitude, a collection of betrayals and loss that had sculpted him as surely as the sculptor's chisel carves marble. He exhaled slowly, as though unburdening himself from a weight he had carried too long alone, and spoke with a voice that was not the authoritative command she had grown accustomed to, but raw in its candor. "Understanding is a luxury I was never afforded." And the confession, stark and unadorned, struck her with force that made her chest ache, for it revealed not cruelty, but the unguarded sorrow of a man who had endured the world's cruelty and emerged armored in stone and silence. Eliza's pulse quickened, yet she did not recoil, sensing the fragile thread upon which this intimacy balanced, delicate as the spider silk that shimmered on the carriage harness after a summer rain. and she reached, not with touch but with words, probing the distance he had maintained, daring to breach it. "Then allow me a fragment of it, Your Grace, even a fraction of understanding." Her voice steady though her fingers itched to brush against the sleeve that had seemed impenetrable, and in that simple plea lay both challenge and tenderness, a quiet defiance that refused either surrender or submission. For a long moment he said nothing, and the silence stretched between them like an uncharted gulf, deep and daunting, before he finally lowered his gaze, eyes finding hers with a depth that startled her, and confessed in measured tones, "I have loved and lost in ways that were never my own to shape, and I have built these walls not to imprison others, but to guard against a frailty I cannot bear to repeat." And the revelation struck her with the intimacy of a whispered secret, a key pressed into a lock that had long resisted intrusion. The storm raged outside, yet within the small chamber of the carriage, time slowed, allowing their words to settle, resonate, and echo in ways beyond mere sound. For in this enforced solitude, the barriers that decorum and fear had erected between them began to crumble imperceptibly, leaving space for a connection neither had anticipated, one forged not of ceremony or societal expectation, but a mutual recognition, fragile and trembling, yet undeniably present. As the carriage crested a hill, lightning illuminating the wet landscape in stark brilliance, Eliza saw the faintest tremor of vulnerability in his posture, the small human signs that had been invisible to polite society, but impossible to hide from those who look with courage and clarity, and she realized with a quiet thrill that this man, feared and untouchable as he was, had laid bare a part of himself she could reach, if only she chose to approach with care and honesty. The revelation was mirrored to her own chest, where pride and longing waged quiet war, and she dared to voice what had lingered unspoken. "You do not frighten me, Your Grace. You disappoint me." Words that carried neither mockery nor disdain, but the truth of her feelings, the acknowledgement of his humanity, and the subtle power of refusing to accept him as he presented himself, while still inviting him closer into the sphere of trust and exposure. His hand, so often a symbol of command and restraint, moved toward hers with deliberation that was neither forceful nor tentative, a gesture suspended between them like the delicate thread of the spider's web glinting in the stormlight, and for a heartbeat, nothing more occurred than the recognition of proximity and the unspoken acknowledgement that the dynamic between them had shifted irrevocably, yet in a manner that required careful tending if it was to survive beyond this night. Finally, he removed the black diamond necklace she received at their formal presentation, replacing it with a simple chain of gold, unadorned and warm in its touch, and murmured in a tone that was both confession and promise, "This you may wear by choice," and the simplicity of the gesture, the relinquishment of ostentation in favor of consent, left her with a sensation both unsettling and tender, for it revealed a capacity for softness beneath the armor, an acknowledgement of her autonomy that was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. The carriage rolled on through the storm, yet the world beyond its walls had faded, leaving only the fragile intimacy that had been wrought in enforced proximity and quiet confession, and though they had not spoken of love, not yet the foundation had been laid, the first fissures in the walls of solitude and control appearing as both warning and invitation, delicate yet impossible to ignore, and Eliza understood that whatever awaited them beyond the night, the dynamic between them had been transformed, and neither could return to the ignorance of prior distance. A distant peal of thunder shook the carriage, and as she rested her hand lightly upon the simple chain, feeling the cool metal warm beneath her fingers, she dared to wonder whether this shift in their bond could survive the scrutiny of the world outside, and whether the man who had long seemed untouchable would allow the softest flicker of trust to illuminate the shadowed corridors of his heart, leaving her poised on the edge of revelation and peril, uncertain of the dawn but certain of the change it had wrought. The storm continued to lash, yet within the small carriage, a fragile quiet prevailed, a moment suspended between confession and consequence, leaving Eliza with a single, undeniable truth. The man beside her, feared by all, had become human in ways that neither law, title, nor scandal could diminish, and the revelation, beautiful and dangerous, promised that the battles yet to come would be waged not only in society's halls, but within the fragile, uncharted territory of the heart itself. The return to London was not marked by triumph, but by tension drawn taut as a violin string, every street they passed seeming to whisper scrutiny, every familiar facade transformed into a silent witness awaiting their misstep. And Eliza felt the fragile understanding forge in stormlight begin to tremble beneath the weight of society's unforgiving gaze, as though the world itself sought to test whether what had passed between them could endure beyond secrecy and shadow. News of renewed scandal had preceded them with ruthless efficiency, distorting half-truths into weapons sharpened by malice, and by the time their carriage halted before Ravenscroft House, invitations had already begun to arrive, summons disguised as courtesies, each bearing the same unspoken demand that the Duchess present herself an answer for the past that refused to remain buried. And Eliza understood with a sinking clarity that this battle would not be waged in whispers alone, but in the full glare of those who had once delighted in her downfall. The Duke received these developments with an outward composure that betrayed nothing, yet she sensed beneath it the same restrained fury she had glimpsed before, not explosive but deliberate, a force that gathered strength in silence. And though he did not immediately speak of defense or retreat, the very stillness of his demeanor suggested that a decision loomed, one that would define not only his standing but the fragile trust that had begun to form between them. The evening of the royal gathering arrived with a brilliance that bordered on cruelty, chandeliers blazing above a sea of silk and expectation. Every noble presence attuned to the subtle drama unfolding beneath the veneer of etiquette, and as Eliza entered upon the Duke's arm, adorned not in the ostentatious black diamonds, but the simple gold chain she had chosen to wear, she felt the shift ripple through the room, curiosity sharpening into something more dangerous, a collective anticipation of either her collapse or his rejection. Whispers rose like a tide, cresting in the corners of conversation, each murmur laden with speculation that now carried the weight of supposed evidence. For letters had surfaced, their contents twisted to suggest impropriety, and though their authenticity remained uncertain, the mere existence of such documents proved enough to ignite society's appetite for condemnation, leaving Eliza exposed once more to the very judgment she had believed herself shielded from, and this time the consequences threatened not only her name, but his. He had been advised, quietly but firmly, to distance himself, to cast doubt upon her character before others could do so more effectively, and in doing so preserve the integrity of his title, a solution both practical and merciless. And as they paused at the edge of the ballroom, Eliza felt the truth of that counsel settle heavily between them, an unspoken question that demanded answer not in private, but before the entire assembly, where every glance awaited his verdict. For a moment that stretched into eternity, he did nothing, his gaze sweeping the room as though weighing his collective judgment against something far more personal, and she braced herself for the possibility that he might choose, as others expected, that the man who had begun to reveal himself in fragments might yet retreat behind the armor that had defined him, leaving her to face alone the storm that had once already threatened to destroy her. And the thought struck deeper than she had anticipated, a quiet betrayal she could neither voice nor deny. Then, with a decisive movement that silenced even the boldest whisper, he guided her forward into the center of the room, not as a man distancing himself from scandal, but as one claiming his place within it. And the subtle shift in his posture, the unmistakable resolve in his expression, altered the atmosphere as surely as a sudden change in weather, drawing all attention toward them with an intensity that left no corner untouched by expectation. When he spoke, his voice did not rise, yet it carried with clarity that commanded silence, each word deliberate and unyielding. My wife's honor is not a matter for debate. It is a fact I will defend even against the world itself. And the declaration, simple yet profound, struck the assembly with the force of revelation, for it was not merely a defense but a refusal to yield, a rejection of the very mechanism by which society maintained its power through doubt and division. The effect was immediate, though not uniform, as some recoiled from the audacity of his stance, while others regarded it with a reluctant respect. Yet none could deny the finality of his words, nor the implication that any further challenge would be met not with quiet dismissal, but with direct confrontation. And in that moment, Eliza felt the balance shift, the narrative no longer dictated solely by rumor, but reshaped by his unwavering assertion of her worth. He turned to her then, not as a master to his charge, but as a man addressing an equal, and in the softened intensity of his gaze she saw not obligation, but something far more dangerous, something that demanded acknowledgment. And he spoke again, this time for her alone, though all could hear. "You did not tame me, Eliza. You revealed a man I had buried, and confession, offered without pretense, resonated with sincerity that stripped away the last vestiges of doubt she had held against him. The weight of his words settled within her, stirring a response that rose not from fear or necessity, but from a place she had long guarded. And she stepped forward, not behind him but beside him, her voice steady as she addressed the watching crowd. "Then let them see us both as we are." And in that simple declaration lay her acceptance not only of him but of the partnership they had forged through conflict and revelation, a unity that neither scandal nor scrutiny could easily fracture. The murmurs that followed were no longer purely condemnatory, but uncertain, fractured by the undeniable strength of the combined stance. And as the evening unfolded, the sharpest accusations began to falter beneath closer examination, inconsistencies emerging where certainty had once seemed absolute, suggesting that the truth behind the scandal was far more complex than it had been portrayed, and that those who had sought to exploit it might yet be exposed in turn. Yet even as the tide began to shift, Eliza felt the lingering question within her remain unresolved, a quiet doubt that no public declaration could entirely silence. And as the crowd dispersed and the night drew toward its conclusion, she turned to him with a gaze that sought not reassurance but truth, asking in a voice that carried the weight of everything they had endured, "Do you love me, or the version of yourself I created?" And the question, poised between vulnerability and challenge, hung in the air between them, unanswered, as the future waited in breathless anticipation. The question lingered between them long after the final carriage had departed, settling into the quiet corridors of Ravenscroft House like a presence neither could dismiss. And though the night had crowned them victorious before the world, Eliza felt no triumph in her chest, only a fragile, aching uncertainty that pulsed beneath her ribs, for public declarations, however grand, could not answer the intimate truth she had dared to ask, nor could they soothe the fear that what bound them might, yet unravel in the silence that followed spectacle. He did not answer her immediately, and that silence, once a weapon he wielded with effortless precision, now felt different, heavier, as though each unspoken word carried the weight of something he had never before been required to name. And she watched him as one might observe a storm gathering not in the sky, but within a man, uncertain whether it would break in destruction or transform into something altogether more revealing. Days passed in a strange, suspended stillness, where the house no longer felt cold yet had not entirely softened, its vast rooms holding echoes of their shifting dynamic. And though he remained attentive in ways subtle yet unmistakable, there persisted a careful distance, as if he feared that any misstep might fracture what had begun to form between them, while Eliza, accustomed to resistance, now found herself navigating the unfamiliar terrain of waiting, where vulnerability required more courage than defiance ever had. The truth of the scandal, once a shadow looming over her, began to unravel through quiet persistence rather than dramatic revelation, threads pulled carefully by those loyal to the Duke, until the web of deceit revealed its architect, a man whose ambition had twisted circumstance into weapon. And though his exposure brought vindication, it did not erase the memory of humiliation, nor the lessons carved into Eliza's spirit by the ordeal. For dignity once threatened is never restored without transformation. When the matter was finally laid to rest and society, ever fickle, turned its gaze toward fresher intrigue, Ravenscroft House exhaled, its atmosphere shifting almost imperceptibly, as though the burden it had carried since her arrival had been lifted. And yet within that newfound quiet, the question she had asked remained unresolved, a delicate fracture beneath the surface of their growing understanding, waiting either to mend or to deepen into something irrevocable. It was in the garden, at the edge of evening, where twilight softened the rigid lines of the estate into something almost tender, that he found her standing among the roses, their blooms heavy with fragrance and shadow, and for a moment he did not speak, simply observe her as though committing her to memory, the way the fading light traced the curve of her profile, the quiet strength in her posture, the same strength that had challenged him when all others had retreated. When he finally approached, his steps were measured not by hesitation but by intention, and as he came to stand beside her, he did not attempt to command the moment, nor to shield himself of the authority he had so often relied upon, instead allowing the silence between them to exist without pretense, until at last he spoke, his voice lower than she had ever heard it, stripped of everything but truth. "I have spent my life mastering control, believing to be the only safeguard against loss." She did not turn immediately, sensing that what followed required stillness, and he continued, each word chosen not for effect but for honesty, But you have undone that certainty, not by force, but by refusing to be shaped by it. And in doing so, you have shown me that what I fear was not weakness, but the absence of something worth risking. And the admission settled between them with a quiet gravity, reshaping the space they occupied into something more intimate than any decoration made. Before an audience, Eliza turned then, her gaze searching his with vulnerability she no longer sought to conceal. And though she had braced herself for uncertainty, for evasion or even retreat, what she found in his expression was something far more disarming, a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. And in that moment she understood that his answer, when it came, would not be crafted to protect either of them, but to reveal what lay beneath the armor he had worn for so long. He reached into his coat and withdrew the black diamond necklace, its dark brilliance catching the last light of day, and for a heartbeat she felt the echo of their first confrontation, the weight of what that gift had once symbolized. But as he stepped closer, she saw that it had been altered, the severe arrangement softened, the stone sent a design that no longer resembled a chain, but something more fluid, more deliberate, and he held it not as an offering to be imposed, but as a question, waiting for her acceptance. "Power," he said quietly, his gaze steady upon hers, "tempered by grace, as you have tempered me." And then, after a pause that seemed to gather all that passed between them into a single moment, he answered the question she had carried, not with flourish but with unvarnished truth. "I love the woman who defied me, who saw me clearly and chose not to turn away. And in loving you, I have found not a reflection of myself, but something greater than I believed I deserved." The words did not overwhelm her, as she might once have expected, but settled into her with a warmth that spread slowly, dissolving the last remnants of doubt that had lingered. And as she stepped closer, allowing him to place the necklace around her neck, she felt not the weight of possession, but the balance of partnership, a silent acknowledgement that what bound them now was not obligation, nor even survival, but a choice renewed in every shared glance and quiet understanding. Their transformation was not marked by grand spectacle, but by subtle shifts, the way his hand lingered at her back not to guide but to reassure, the way her voice softened not in submission but in trust. And within the walls of Ravenscroft House, once defined by control and silence, a new rhythm emerged, one that allowed for both strength and vulnerability, for both fire and quiet. And in that balance they found something neither had expected to claim. As the last light faded and the garden settled into shadow, they stood together without the weight of an audience, without the scrutiny that had once dictated their every move. And in that solitude there was a freedom more profound than any victory, a sense that what they had forged would endure not because it had been tested by society, but because it had been chosen in defiance of it, again and again. Yet even as that certainty took root, the future stretched before them not as a calm horizon, but as an uncharted expanse, filled with the unpredictable tides of a world that would never entirely relinquish its hold. And as Eliza rested her hand lightly over his, feeling the steady pulse beneath the skin, she understood that their story had not concluded with this moment of clarity, but had instead begun anew, shaped not by fear or expectation, but by the fragile, exhilarating promise of a love that would demand everything and offer no guarantees beyond its own fierce, unyielding truth.